The autumn rain drummed against the stained glass windows of Hope Baptist Church in Millbrook, Tennessee, as the Wednesday evening service came to a close on October 16th, 1996. Sister Rebecca Matthews, a 28-year-old missionary who had recently returned from 3 years serving in Guatemala, stood at the front of the sanctuary, her warm brown eyes reflecting the golden light of the chandeliers as she finished sharing her testimony. "God's love knows no borders," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the gentle conviction that had touched thousands of hearts, both in Central America and here in her hometown. "Whether we're ministering to children in the mountains of Guatemala or serving our neighbors right here in Millbrook, the Lord calls us to be His hands and feet wherever He places us." The congregation of nearly 200 people listened intently as Rebecca described her mission work, building schools, providing medical care to remote villages, and sharing the gospel with indigenous communities who had never heard the name of Jesus. Her shoulder-length auburn hair caught the light as she gestured, and the simple blue dress she wore bore the marks of someone who chose substance over style, ministry over material comfort. Pastor William Thornton, a distinguished man in his early 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, stepped forward as Rebecca concluded her presentation. "Sister Rebecca, your heart for missions continues to inspire us all. The Mission Board is grateful for your willingness to return to Guatemala next month to continue this vital work." Rebecca smiled, touching the small silver cross that hung from a delicate chain around her neck, a gift from the children at the Guatemalan orphanage where she had volunteered. "Thank you, Pastor Thornton. I'm excited to return and continue building the medical clinic we started last year. The need is so great, but God's provision is greater." As the service ended with a closing hymn, "How Great Thou Art," Rebecca's clear soprano voice rose above the congregation, her face radiating the peace that had characterized her entire adult life. She had given her heart to Jesus at age 12, during a summer revival at this very church, and in the 16 years since, her faith had only grown stronger and deeper. After the benediction, members of the congregation gathered around Rebecca to ask questions about her mission work and to express their support for her upcoming return to Guatemala. Margaret Foster, an elderly widow who had known Rebecca since childhood, approached with tears in her eyes. "Becca, dear," Margaret said, using the nickname Rebecca had carried since she was a little girl, helping her grandmother arrange flowers for Sunday services. "I want you to know how proud your grandmother would be of the woman you've become. She always said you had a special calling on your life." Rebecca hugged the older woman warmly. "Grandma Rose was the one who first told me about missions when I was 8 years old. She showed me pictures of missionaries in Africa and told me that God sometimes calls people to leave everything familiar to serve Him in far-off places. I think that planted the first seed in my heart." As the crowd gradually thinned, Rebecca gathered her belongings from the front pew, her worn leather Bible with numerous bookmarks, a small notebook where she jotted down prayer requests, and a canvas bag containing photographs from Guatemala that she had shared during her presentation. She made her way toward the church office, where she planned to finalize some paperwork with the missions committee before heading home to her small apartment on Maple Street. The church building, constructed in 1923, had the familiar smell of old wood, furniture polish, and the lingering scent of coffee from the fellowship hall. Rebecca had always found comfort in these familiar surroundings: the mahogany pews where her family had sat for 3 generations, the baptistry where she had been immersed at age 12, and the prayer room where she had spent countless hours seeking God's will for her life. As she walked down the corridor toward the administrative offices, Rebecca noticed that the light was still on in Pastor Thornton's study. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear voices inside, Pastor Thornton's familiar baritone and what sounded like 2 other men, One voice she recognized as belonging to Deacon Robert Hayes, a prominent local businessman who served as chairman of the church's finance committee. The other voice was unfamiliar, carrying a slight accent that she couldn't quite place. Rebecca hesitated, not wanting to interrupt what seemed to be an important meeting. But as she stood in the hallway, fragments of the conversation drifted through the partially open door. What she heard made her blood run cold. The funds from the Guatemala mission account, nobody will ever know if we redirect some of it. She's asking too many questions about the budget. Rebecca's heart began to pound as she realized they were discussing the mission funds, money that had been donated specifically to support her work and the medical clinic project in Guatemala. Her hand trembled as she reached for her notebook, instinctively wanting to document what she was hearing. Rebecca is scheduled to return to Guatemala on November 15th, she heard Pastor Thornton saying. She'll expect to receive the full amount that was pledged for the clinic construction. That's exactly the problem, came the unfamiliar voice with the accent. We need that money for the land deal before the end of the month. The opportunity won't wait, but those funds were donated specifically for missions, Deacon Hayes protested, though his voice lacked conviction. The congregation trusts us to use their gifts appropriately. Robert, listen to me, the accented voice continued, more forcefully now. This land development project will triple our investment within 6 months. We can replace the mission funds before anyone notices they're gone. Think of it as a short-term loan that will ultimately benefit the church's long-term financial stability. Rebecca felt sick to her stomach. She had watched congregation members make sacrificial gifts to support the Guatemala mission. Elderly people on fixed incomes giving their grocery money, young families forgoing vacation plans to contribute to the medical clinic, children emptying their piggy banks to help build schools for Guatemalan children. The thought that these sacred gifts might be diverted for personal profit was unconscionable. I don't know, Pastor Thornton's voice carried a note of uncertainty. If this ever came to light, it won't come to light if we handle it properly, the stranger replied. But we need to make sure that certain people don't have access to information that could complicate things. People who might ask uncomfortable questions. Rebecca realized with a chill that they were talking about her. As the missionary responsible for the Guatemala project, she would naturally expect detailed financial reports and would likely notice if the promised funds were not available when she arrived in Guatemala. Her hands shaking, Rebecca quietly opened her notebook and began writing down what she had heard, including approximate times and the names of the people she could identify. Her grandmother had always taught her that truth had a way of coming to light, but sometimes it needed help from faithful people who were willing to stand up for what was right. As the voices in the pastor's study grew louder, Rebecca realized that the conversation was coming to an end. She quickly closed her notebook and hurried down the hallway toward the exit, her mind racing with the implications of what she had discovered. How could Pastor Thornton, whom she had trusted and respected for years, be involved in such a scheme? And who was the man with the accent who seemed to be orchestrating this betrayal? Rebecca reached the church's main entrance just as the autumn rain intensified, drumming harder against the windows and obscuring the streetlights outside. She paused under the covered entryway, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she tried to process what she had just learned. Her faith had always been simple and pure. Trust God, serve others, and believe that good would ultimately triumph over evil. But now she found herself facing a crisis that challenged everything she thought she knew about the people and institutions she had devoted her life to serving. As she stood there in the rain, Rebecca whispered a prayer that would later be found written in her diary. Lord, show me what to do with this knowledge. Help me to be wise as a serpent, but gentle as a dove. If there is corruption in your house, give me the courage to expose it no matter the cost. But above all, let your will be done. She pulled out her car keys and ran through the rain to her small blue Honda Civic, the same car that had carried her to countless mission meetings, hospital visits, and prayer gatherings over the past 5 years. As she drove through the quiet streets of Millbrook toward her apartment, Rebecca had no way of knowing that she would never reach her destination, and that the notebook containing her account of that evening's conversation would disappear along with her. The last person to see Rebecca Matthews alive was Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, an insomniac neighbor who happened to be looking out her window at 10:47 p.m. when Rebecca's car pulled into the parking lot of the Maple Street apartments. Mrs. Patterson later told police that she had watched Rebecca gather her belongings from the car and walk toward the building entrance, but she had turned away from the window before seeing Rebecca actually enter the building. When Rebecca failed to appear for her Thursday morning shift at the church office, where she was helping to prepare materials for the upcoming missions conference, Pastor Thornton initially assumed she might be feeling unwell. But when she also missed the Thursday evening prayer meeting, something she had never done in the 5 years since returning from college, concern began to grow. It was Margaret Foster who first suggested calling the police after Rebecca failed to answer her phone throughout Friday morning. As one of Rebecca's closest friends in the congregation, Margaret knew that Rebecca would never simply disappear without explanation, especially with her return trip to Guatemala just a month away. Detective Sarah Chen of the Millbrook Police Department took the missing person report on Friday afternoon, October 18th, 1996. A thorough and methodical investigator with 8 years of experience, Detective Chen immediately noticed several unusual aspects of Rebecca's disappearance. Her car is in the parking lot, her purse is in her apartment, and there's no sign of a struggle, Detective Chen reported to her supervisor. But her Bible and a notebook she was known to carry are missing. For someone as religious as Miss Matthews reportedly was, taking her Bible suggests this might have been planned. The initial investigation revealed that Rebecca had returned to her apartment Wednesday night. Her neighbor had seen her arrive, but there was no evidence that she had ever entered the building. The mystery deepened when Detective Chen discovered that Rebecca's apartment key was found in the parking lot the next morning by a maintenance worker, as if it had been dropped during a struggle. As news of Rebecca's disappearance spread through Millbrook, the small town of 8,000 people rallied together in an unprecedented search effort. Hope Baptist Church became the command center for volunteer search teams that combed through the surrounding forests, fields, and along the Tennessee River that wound through the county. Pastor Thornton appeared genuinely distraught by Rebecca's disappearance, leading prayer vigils and coordinating with the police investigation. In the days following her vanishing, he preached powerful sermons about trusting God during times of uncertainty and about the eternal hope that sustained believers even in the darkest valleys. Sister Rebecca would want us to remember that our hope is not in this temporary world, Pastor Thornton declared from the pulpit on the Sunday following her disappearance. Whether she has been called home to be with the Lord, or whether she is somewhere in need of our prayers, we can trust that God's plan is perfect and His love is unfailing. The congregation wept as they sang Rebecca's favorite hymn, "It is Well With My Soul," and many members came forward to make additional pledges to the Guatemala Mission Fund in honor of her service. Ironically, the very funds that Rebecca had died trying to protect were being increased by people who had no idea that their previous donations had been stolen. For weeks, the investigation continued with declining intensity. Detective Chen followed every lead, interviewed dozens of people, and even consulted with federal authorities when the possibility arose that Rebecca might have been kidnapped by someone connected to her mission work in Guatemala. But as autumn turned to winter and winter gave way to spring, hope of finding Rebecca Matthews began to fade. The case remained officially open, but with no new leads and no evidence of foul play beyond the mysterious circumstances of her disappearance. It gradually became one of those tragic mysteries that small towns carry in their collective memory. A reminder that sometimes good people simply vanish, leaving behind only questions and grief. What no one in Millbrook knew was that Rebecca's notebook, containing her account of the conversation she had overheard in Pastor Thornton's study, had been carefully hidden by someone who knew its contents could destroy lives and expose a web of corruption that reached far beyond the walls of Hope Baptist Church. The truth would remain buried for 27 years, waiting for God's perfect timing to bring light to the darkness and justice to those who had been wronged. In the months following Rebecca Matthews's disappearance, Hope Baptist Church struggled to maintain its sense of community and purpose. The young woman who had embodied the congregation's mission heart was gone, leaving behind a void that seemed impossible to fill. Yet it was during this time of grief that the true character of the church family began to emerge. Margaret Foster, despite her 73 years, took on the role of unofficial coordinator for the ongoing search efforts. Every Saturday morning for 6 months, she organized teams of volunteers to search areas that might have been overlooked by the initial investigation. Her kitchen became a staging area where she prepared sandwiches and thermoses of coffee for the search teams, and her living room wall was covered with maps marking every location that had been searched. "Becca is out there somewhere," Margaret would tell anyone who suggested it might be time to scale back the search efforts. "That girl has been fighting for others her whole life. The least we can do is keep fighting for her." Detective Sarah. Jen found herself drawn into the emotional orbit of Rebecca's case in a way that surprised her professional sensibilities. There was something about the missionary's disappearance that didn't fit the typical patterns she had learned to recognize over her years in law enforcement. Missing persons cases usually involved people who had reasons to disappear. Financial troubles, relationship problems, legal issues, or mental health crises. But Rebecca Matthews had been, by all accounts, completely stable and deeply rooted in her community. She had everything to live for, Chen confided to her partner, Detective Mike Reynolds, as they reviewed the case file for the dozenth time. A calling she was passionate about, a community that loved her, and plans to return to Guatemala that she was genuinely excited about. People don't just walk away from that kind of life. Reynolds, a 20-year veteran of the force, had seen enough missing persons cases to be more pragmatic. Maybe she had a breakdown. Sometimes the pressure of being everyone's perfect Christian girl gets to be too much. Maybe she's in another state somewhere, trying to figure out who she is when she's not being Sister Rebecca. But Chen shook her head. "I've talked to her college roommates, her mission supervisors, her family. Everyone describes the same person, genuine, consistent, at peace with herself and her faith. This wasn't someone on the verge of a breakdown, but the investigation had revealed several puzzling details that kept Chen from closing the case. Rebecca's car had been found unlocked, which was unusual for someone as security conscious as she was known to be. Her apartment showed no signs of hurried packing or preparation for a trip, yet several personal items were missing, along with her Bible and notebook. Most intriguingly, the church's financial records from the period immediately following Rebecca's disappearance showed some unusual transactions. Large sums had been moved between accounts, and the Guatemala Mission Fund, which had grown to over $40,000 thanks to the congregation's generous response to Rebecca's testimony, had been temporarily reallocated for what the records described as urgent building maintenance. When Chen questioned Pastor Thornton about these financial movements, he explained that the church had discovered some structural issues that required immediate attention. "The timing was unfortunate," he said, his eyes not quite meeting the detective's gaze. "But we couldn't risk the safety of our congregation. The mission funds will be restored before Rebecca's scheduled return." But Rebecca never returned, and Chen noticed that the mission account was gradually replenished through new donations, rather than being restored from wherever the original funds had gone. It was suspicious, but not necessarily criminal, and without Rebecca there to verify what funds she had been expecting, it was difficult to prove any wrongdoing. As 1997 dawned, the active search for Rebecca had largely ended, but the impact of her disappearance continued to ripple through the community. Several families left Hope Baptist Church, unable to worship in a place that reminded them of their missing friend. Others threw themselves more deeply into church activities, as if their increased devotion could somehow bring Rebecca back, or make sense of her disappearance. Margaret Foster fell into the latter category. She increased her involvement in the church's missions program, partly to honor Rebecca's memory and partly because she couldn't shake the feeling that there were important details about Rebecca's work that had been overlooked. As she organized Rebecca's mission files and prepared materials for whoever would eventually take over the Guatemala project, Margaret made a discovery that troubled her deeply. Hidden in Rebecca's desk at the church office, Margaret found a manila folder labeled Financial Questions that contained photocopies of bank statements, donation records, and what appeared to be Rebecca's handwritten calculations. The numbers didn't add up. According to Rebecca's careful documentation, there was a significant discrepancy between what had been donated to the Guatemala Mission Fund and what the official church records showed. Margaret brought her concerns to Pastor Thornton, expecting him to be as troubled by the discrepancies as she was. Instead, she found him oddly dismissive. "Margaret, I appreciate your diligence," Pastor Thornton said, barely glancing at the documents she had brought. But Rebecca was a wonderful young woman, not a trained accountant. It's entirely possible that she misunderstood some of the financial procedures or made errors in her calculations. "But Pastor," Margaret persisted, "these photocopies are of actual bank statements. She wasn't calculating, she was documenting." Pastor Thornton's expression hardened slightly. "Margaret, I think grief may be affecting your judgment. Rebecca's disappearance has been difficult for all of us, but we can't allow suspicion and paranoia to destroy the unity of our church family. These financial matters are handled by qualified professionals, and I can assure you that every penny donated to missions is being used appropriately." Margaret left the pastor's office feeling confused and unsettled. In 47 years of membership at Hope Baptist Church, she had never been dismissed so curtly by a pastor. She decided to take the documents to Detective Chen, thinking that a neutral party might be able to make sense of what Rebecca had discovered. Detective Chen studied the financial documents with great interest. While she wasn't a forensic accountant, she could see clear patterns that suggested funds had been moved in ways that didn't match the church's stated purposes. More importantly, the documents proved that Rebecca had been investigating financial irregularities in the weeks before her disappearance. "Mrs. Foster," Chen said after reviewing the materials, "this gives us the first potential motive we've had in this case. If Rebecca discovered financial misconduct and was planning to expose it, that could certainly be a reason for someone to want her to disappear." But when Chen approached church leadership about investigating the financial irregularities more thoroughly, she encountered unexpected resistance. Pastor Thornton consulted with the church's attorney and informed the detective that the church was invoking its religious autonomy to decline cooperation with any investigation into internal financial matters. "We're happy to continue cooperating with any investigation into Sister Rebecca's disappearance," the church's attorney informed Chen in a formal letter. However, The church's financial records are privileged under religious freedom protections, and we will not allow a fishing expedition that could damage the reputation of our institution based on the amateur calculations of a missing person. Chen found herself at an impasse. Without a clear crime and without cooperation from the church, she couldn't obtain warrants to examine the financial records more thoroughly. The case remained open, but the investigation had effectively stalled. As 1997 turned to 1998, life in Millbrook began to return to a new normal. Pastor Thornton announced that the church would be suspending its Guatemala mission program indefinitely, citing the difficulty of finding someone with Rebecca's unique qualifications and experience. The decision disappointed many congregation members, but the leadership explained that it would be irresponsible to send inadequately prepared missionaries to such a challenging field. Margaret Foster remained the keeper of Rebecca's memory, maintaining a small memorial garden behind the church where she planted flowers each spring in Rebecca's honor. She also continued to pray daily for Rebecca's safe return, even as hope faded that her young friend would ever be found alive. "I know in my heart that Rebecca didn't just walk away," Margaret confided to her sister during one of their weekly phone calls. "That girl had more purpose and direction than anyone I've ever known. Something happened to her, and I believe someday we'll learn the truth." Detective Chen transferred to a position with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation in 1999, but she never forgot Rebecca Matthews' case. She kept copies of all the case files and continued to review them periodically, hoping that time and distance might reveal details she had missed during the active investigation. In 2001, 5 years after Rebecca's disappearance, Hope Baptist Church underwent a significant renovation. Pastor Thornton announced that the congregation had been blessed with an unexpected bequest from a longtime member, allowing them to upgrade the sanctuary, install new sound equipment, and modernize the office facilities. Margaret Foster noticed that the renovation included extensive work on the church office area where Rebecca had kept her mission files. When she asked Pastor Thornton if she could retrieve any remaining materials that might be relevant to Rebecca's memory, she was told that all old files had been disposed of during the renovation to make room for modern filing systems. "It seemed like everything connected to Becca was being erased," Margaret later told her sister. "Her office was completely gutted, her files were thrown away, and even the memorial plaque we had planned for the mission's hallway was quietly shelved." By 2005, nearly a decade after Rebecca's disappearance, most of Millbrook had moved on from the mystery. New families had joined Hope Baptist Church, and many of the current members had never known Rebecca personally. Pastor Thornton had successfully established the church as a regional leader in conservative theology and traditional values, attracting members from surrounding counties who appreciated his biblical scholarship and moral leadership. But Margaret Foster, now in her 80s, never stopped believing that the truth about Rebecca Matthews would eventually come to light. She continued to tend the memorial garden and to pray for answers, even as her own health began to decline. "God sees everything," she would whisper as she watered the flowers in Rebecca's garden. "He knows what happened to our girl, and in his time, he'll make sure justice is done." Margaret Foster had no way of knowing how prophetic her words would prove to be, or that the truth about Rebecca Matthews was indeed being carefully preserved, waiting for exactly the right moment to emerge from the darkness. Detective Chen, now working cold cases for the TBI, occasionally pulled Rebecca's file and wondered what had become of the earnest young missionary whose disappearance had haunted her early career. In quiet moments, she found herself hoping that somewhere, somehow, Rebecca had found peace, whether in this life or the next. The years passed quietly in Millbrook, but beneath the surface of the community's apparent tranquility, guilt and secrets festered like untreated wounds. Those who knew the truth about Rebecca Matthews carried their knowledge like stones in their hearts, growing heavier with each passing year. Pastor Thornton, now in his 70s, had built a reputation as one of Tennessee's most respected religious leaders. He spoke at conferences, wrote books on Christian leadership, and was frequently consulted by other churches facing difficult decisions. But those closest to him noticed that he never spoke about Rebecca Matthews, and that he seemed to age more rapidly than his years would suggest. Deacon Robert Hayes had prospered financially over the years, his business ventures succeeding beyond his wildest dreams. He had funded scholarships, donated to charities, and built a reputation as one of Millbrook's most generous citizens. But his wife often found him staring out the window in the early morning hours, and she noticed that he had stopped sleeping well sometime in the late 1990s. The third man who had been in Pastor Thornton's office that October night in 1996 had left Millbrook within months of Rebecca's disappearance, claiming that business opportunities were calling him elsewhere. He had covered his tracks carefully and built a new life in another state, but he had never been able to escape the memory of a young woman's face or the knowledge of what his greed had cost. None of them knew that Rebecca Matthews, in her final hours, had found a way to ensure that their crimes would not remain hidden forever. With the same methodical care that had characterized her mission work, she had documented everything she had discovered and had hidden her evidence in a place where it would be safe until God's timing was perfect for the truth to emerge. 27. Years after that rainy October night, Margaret Foster's faith would be vindicated, Detective Chen's instincts would be proven correct, and Rebecca Matthews would finally receive the justice that had been denied to her for nearly 3 decades. The truth had been waiting patiently, like a seed buried in winter soil, ready to spring to life when the conditions were finally right for it to grow. By the spring of 2023, Hope Baptist Church had evolved considerably from the small congregation that Rebecca Matthews had known and loved. Under Pastor Thornton's leadership, the church had grown to over 800 members and had become a cornerstone of Millbrook's religious community. The building itself had been expanded twice, with a modern fellowship hall, updated classrooms, and a state-of-the-art media center that broadcast services to 3 neighboring counties. Pastor William Thornton, now 79 years old and showing signs of his advanced age, had announced his intention to retire at the end of the year. The church board had begun the process of searching for his replacement, and the congregation was preparing for the transition with a mixture of gratitude for his long service and anxiety about the future. Margaret Foster had passed away peacefully in 2019 at the age of 95, still tending Rebecca's memorial garden until just weeks before her death. In her final conversation with her nephew, she had made him promise to continue caring for the flowers and to never stop believing that the truth about Rebecca would someday emerge. "Some stories don't end when we think they do," she had whispered from her hospital bed. "God's timing isn't our timing, but His justice is perfect. Becca's story isn't over yet." The renovation project that would change everything began in March 2023, when the church board decided to modernize the original sanctuary to accommodate live streaming and improved accessibility for elderly members. The project was overseen by Thompson Construction, a local company owned by James Thompson, whose grandfather had been a member of Hope Baptist Church for over 50 years. James Thompson, a thoughtful man in his 40s with a reputation for meticulous work, had always been fascinated by the history of old buildings. As his crew began the renovation work, he took special care to preserve any historical artifacts they might discover and to document the original construction techniques used in the 1920s. The discovery occurred on a warm Tuesday morning in May, during the installation of new heating and cooling systems that required access to spaces that had been sealed since the church's construction. Thompson's crew was working in the basement area beneath the original sanctuary when they encountered an unusual structural anomaly. "Mr. Thompson," called out Danny Martinez, one of the younger crew members, "you need to see this. There's something weird about this wall down here." Thompson descended into the basement area, where Martinez was shining a flashlight on what appeared to be a section of wall that didn't match the rest of the foundation. The brickwork was clearly from a different era, and the mortar showed signs of having been recently applied within the last 30 years rather than the original construction. In the 1920s, this wall was added later, Thompson observed, running his hands over the surface. And it's not structural. It's just filling in what used to be a storage alcove or utility space. As Thompson examined the wall more closely, he noticed that the newer brickwork seemed to bulge slightly in one area, as if something behind it was pressing outward. His construction experience told him that this was exactly the kind of irregular work that suggested something had been hidden and then hastily concealed. "Danny, let's see what's behind this wall," Thompson decided. "But we'll do it carefully. If this is hiding something historical, we don't want to damage it." Using hand tools rather than power equipment, Thompson and Martinez carefully removed several bricks from the area where the wall bulged. As the opening grew larger, Thompson's flashlight beam revealed a small cavity that had been deliberately sealed off from the rest of the basement. Inside the cavity, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic and protected by a waterproof container, was a leather-bound journal, along with several manila folders containing documents and photographs. The preservation was remarkable. Whoever had hidden these materials had taken extraordinary care to protect them from moisture and decay. Thompson's hands trembled slightly as he carefully extracted the container from its hiding place. His grandfather had told him stories about the church's history, including the tragic disappearance of the young missionary in the 1990s. As he examined the journal more closely, he saw the name Rebecca Matthews written in elegant script on the cover. "Danny," Thompson said quietly, "I think we just found something that's going to change a lot of lives." Within an hour, Thompson had contacted Pastor Thornton to inform him of the discovery. The elderly pastor's reaction was immediate and visceral. He insisted on seeing the materials before anyone else was contacted, and he arrived at the church within minutes of Thompson's call. Pastor Thornton's face went ashen when Thompson showed him the journal and the accompanying documents. For nearly 3 decades, he had lived with the knowledge that Rebecca Matthews had died because of what she had discovered about the church's financial corruption. But he had convinced himself that her evidence had died with her and that the truth would remain buried forever. "Where exactly did you find this?" Pastor Thornton asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thompson led him to the basement cavity, explaining how the wall had been clearly added some time after the original construction. As they stood in the basement, Pastor Thornton's memories transported him back to that terrible night in October 1996, when everything had gone wrong. After Rebecca's disappearance, it had been Thornton himself who had suggested sealing off the basement storage area where they had temporarily hidden her belongings while deciding what to do with them. He had convinced the other conspirators that it was the safest place to keep the evidence until they could find a more permanent solution. But as weeks turned to months and months turned to years, the sealed basement had become a kind of tomb for their guilty consciences. Thornton had tried to forget what lay behind that wall, but the knowledge had haunted him for 27 years. "Pastor," Thompson said gently, noticing the older man's distress, "I think we need to contact the police about this. These materials might provide important information about what happened to Miss Matthews." Pastor Thornton's instinct was to destroy the journal and documents immediately, to protect himself and the few remaining conspirators who were still alive. But at 79, facing his own mortality and the approaching end of his ministry, he found himself unable to commit another crime, to cover up the ones he had already committed. "You're right, James," he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "The authorities need to see this." Detective Sarah Chen, now a senior investigator with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, received the call about the discovery at 3:30 p.m. on that Tuesday afternoon. 27 years after she had reluctantly closed the active investigation into Rebecca Matthews' disappearance, she found herself driving back to Millbrook with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Chen had never forgotten Rebecca's case. Throughout her career, she had periodically reviewed the file, hoping that new technology or fresh perspectives might reveal clues that had been missed during the original investigation. The case had taught her that sometimes the most baffling mysteries had the simplest explanations, and that the truth often lay hidden in plain sight. When Chen arrived at Hope Baptist Church, she found James Thompson waiting in the parking lot, with a cardboard box containing the materials he had discovered. Pastor Thornton sat in his car nearby, looking as if he had aged 10 years in the few hours since the discovery. "Detective Chen," Thompson said, recognizing her from news coverage of other high-profile cases she had solved over the years, "I'm hoping these materials might finally provide some answers about what happened to Rebecca Matthews." Chen carefully examined the journal and documents, noting the meticulous preservation and the obvious care that had been taken to protect them from damage. As she opened Rebecca's journal to the final entries written in the days before her disappearance, she felt the same investigative instincts that had first drawn her to police work stirring to life. The journal entries painted a picture of a young woman who had discovered something terrible and was struggling with how to respond to her knowledge. Rebecca's final entry, dated October 16, 1996, the day she disappeared, contained detailed information about the financial corruption she had uncovered and her plans to document everything she had learned. October 16, 1996. "I know now that I'm in danger. After overhearing the conversation in Pastor Thornton's office tonight, I understand that there are people who will do anything to protect their secrets. But I also know that God has called me to be a voice for the voiceless, and that includes the people whose donations have been stolen to fund personal business ventures. I've made copies of all the financial documents I could access, and I've hidden everything in a place where it will be safe until the right time comes for the truth to emerge. If something happens to me, I pray that someday these materials will be found by someone who has the courage to seek justice. I'm not afraid of death. My hope is in eternal life through Jesus Christ. But I am afraid of what will happen to the Guatemala mission if these funds are stolen, and I'm afraid of how many other people might be hurt if this corruption continues. Lord, I place my life in your hands. If you call me home tonight, I'm ready. But if you preserve my life, help me to be brave enough to do what's right, no matter the cost." Detective Chen felt tears forming in her eyes as she read Rebecca's final words. Here was a woman who had faced death with remarkable courage, motivated not by personal gain, but by concern for others who might be hurt by the corruption she had discovered. The documents that accompanied the journal provided detailed evidence of the financial fraud that Rebecca had uncovered. Bank statements, photocopied checks, and handwritten calculations showed how mission funds had been diverted to support a land development scheme that had ultimately made several church leaders wealthy at the expense of the congregation's charitable donations. As Chen studied the evidence, she began to understand the scope of the conspiracy that had led to Rebecca's death. This wasn't a simple case of embezzlement. It was a carefully orchestrated fraud that had involved multiple people and had continued for years after Rebecca's murder. "Mr. Thompson," Chen said after completing her initial review of the materials, I need you to show me exactly where you found these items, and I need to speak with Pastor Thornton about his knowledge of these financial irregularities." But when Chen looked around for Pastor Thornton, she discovered that his car was gone. The elderly pastor had fled the scene, apparently unable to face the consequences of the truth that had finally emerged after 27 years of concealment. Chen immediately issued an alert for Pastor Thornton's vehicle and began coordinating with local law enforcement to locate him before he could destroy additional evidence or harm himself. But her primary focus remained on the materials that Rebecca had so carefully preserved, knowing that they held the key to solving not just her disappearance, but also her murder. As Chen continued her examination of Rebecca's journal, she found entries that provided crucial details about the conspiracy Rebecca had discovered. The land development scheme that had stolen the mission funds involved 3 primary conspirators: Pastor Thornton, Deacon Robert Hayes, and a businessman named Victor Petrov, whose accent Rebecca had noted during the conversation she overheard. According to Rebecca's meticulous documentation, Petrov had approached the church leadership with what he presented as a risk-free investment opportunity. Using the Guatemala mission funds as initial capital, they could purchase undeveloped land on the outskirts of Millbrook that Petrov claimed would be rezoned for commercial development within 6 months. The plan was to triple their investment quickly and then return the original mission funds to the church account before Rebecca's scheduled departure for Guatemala. But Rebecca's research had revealed that Petrov had a history of similar schemes in other communities, and that the promised rezoning was based on fraudulent information he had provided to gullible church leaders. More damning still, Rebecca had discovered that this wasn't the first time Hope Baptist Church's funds had been diverted for personal gain. Her investigation had uncovered a pattern of financial irregularities dating back several years, with smaller amounts being siphoned off from various church accounts to fund the conspirators' business ventures. "They've been stealing from God's house for years," Rebecca had written in her journal. The Guatemala Mission Fund was just the largest target because of the amount of money involved. But they've also taken funds from the building maintenance account, the youth ministry budget, and even the emergency assistance fund that's supposed to help families in crisis. As Chen read these revelations, she began to understand the true scope of the crimes that had been committed. This wasn't just about one missing missionary. It was about a systematic betrayal of trust that had robbed an entire congregation of resources meant to help the poor, support missions, and maintain their place of worship. The journal also contained disturbing details about the threats Rebecca had received after she began asking questions about the church's finances. Anonymous phone calls warning her to mind her own business, mysterious vandalism to her car, and even a break-in at her apartment where nothing was stolen, but her mission files had been thoroughly searched. October 10th, 1996. Someone broke into my apartment while I was at the Wednesday night service. They didn't take anything valuable. Not my jewelry, not the cash I keep in my dresser drawer, not even my computer. But they went through all my mission files and left everything in disarray, as if they were looking for something specific. I know now that they're trying to find out how much I know and what evidence I might have gathered. That's why I've decided to hide copies of everything in a place where they'll never think to look. If something happens to me, at least the truth will survive. Chen realized that Rebecca had been living under a death threat for at least a week before her disappearance, but had been too committed to protecting the mission funds to flee to safety. The young woman had essentially sacrificed her life to preserve evidence that would eventually bring her killers to justice. As the afternoon wore on, Chen's investigation team arrived from Nashville to begin processing the crime scene and examining the evidence The basement cavity where Rebecca's journal had been hidden was photographed and measured, and forensic specialists began searching for any additional materials that might have been concealed in other parts of the building. Meanwhile, the search for Pastor Thornton intensified. His wife, contacted at their home, reported that he had returned briefly around 4 p.m., packed a small suitcase, and left without explanation. She said he had appeared extremely agitated and had muttered something about finally having to face the music. At 7:30 p.m., Pastor Thornton's car was found in the parking lot of the Tennessee River Overlook, a scenic area about 15 miles outside Millbrook. A note on the dashboard, written in the pastor's distinctive handwriting, read, "I cannot live with what I've done any longer. Rebecca Matthews was an innocent young woman who died because of my greed and cowardice. I pray that God will forgive me and that her family will find peace in knowing the truth." A massive search and rescue operation was launched along the river, but Pastor Thornton's body was not recovered until 3 days later, when it was found by fishermen nearly 20 miles downstream. The medical examiner ruled his death a suicide by drowning and noted that the 79-year-old pastor had left no doubt about his intentions in the suicide note found in his car. With Pastor Thornton's death, the investigation took on new urgency. Jen knew that the remaining conspirators might attempt to flee or destroy evidence once they learned that Rebecca's journal had been discovered. She immediately obtained search warrants for the homes and businesses of Robert Hayes and began the process of tracking down Victor Petrov, who had apparently left Millbrook shortly after Rebecca's murder and had been living under an assumed name in Florida. The search of Robert Hayes's home yielded a treasure trove of evidence. In a fireproof safe in his basement, investigators found bank records, correspondence with Petrov, and, most shocking of all, a detailed confession that Hayes had apparently written years earlier, but had never had the courage to deliver to authorities. Hayes's confession provided the missing pieces of the puzzle that Rebecca's journal had begun to assemble. According to his account, Rebecca had confronted the 3 conspirators on the night of October 16, 1996, after overhearing their conversation in Pastor Thornton's office. She came back to the church around 11 p.m., Hayes had written in his confession. She said she had been praying about what she had heard and that God had told her she couldn't remain silent about the theft of the mission funds. She demanded that we return the money immediately and confess our crimes to the congregation. Victor Petrov became enraged and told Rebecca that she was naive and foolish, that no one would believe her accusations against such respected church leaders. When she threatened to go to the police, Petrov grabbed her and shook her violently. I will never forget the sound of her head hitting the corner of Pastor Thornton's desk. We thought she was just unconscious, but when we checked for a pulse, we realized she was dead. Petrov said we had to make it look like she had disappeared voluntarily, that we couldn't let her death destroy our lives and families. Pastor Thornton was in shock, but he went along with Petrov's plan to hide her body and cover up what had happened. We buried Rebecca in the woods behind the church, in a place where we thought she would never be found. Then we sealed her journal and the evidence she had gathered in the basement, planning to retrieve it later when things calmed down. But as the years passed, we never found the courage to go back for it, and eventually we convinced ourselves that it was safer to leave everything hidden. I have lived with this guilt for over 20 years. I see Rebecca's face in my dreams, and I hear her voice asking why we chose money over righteousness. I know that I'm a coward for not confessing earlier, but I pray that someday the truth will emerge and that justice will be done for the innocent young woman we killed through our greed and pride. Hayes' confession was dated December 25, 2015, Christmas Day, suggesting that the weight of his guilt had become particularly unbearable during a season focused on redemption and forgiveness. but he had apparently lacked the courage to deliver. The confession to authorities, keeping it locked away like a guilty secret that grew heavier with each passing year. When Detective Chen arrived at Hayes's business to arrest him, she found that he had suffered a massive heart attack in his office earlier that morning. Paramedics were unable to revive him, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. A preliminary investigation suggested that the stress of learning about the discovery of Rebecca's journal had triggered the fatal cardiac event. With 2 of the 3 conspirators now dead, the focus of the investigation turned to locating Victor Petrov, the apparent ringleader of the scheme who had fled Tennessee shortly after Rebecca's murder. Chen worked with federal authorities to trace Petrov's movements over the past 27 years, following a trail of similar fraudulent schemes in multiple states. The search for Petrov led to a retirement community in Sarasota, Florida, where he had been living under the name Victor Peterson for the past 15 years. Federal marshals arrested him without incident as he was leaving a morning church service, an irony that was not lost on the investigators who had spent months tracking him down. At age 74, Petrov was a shadow of the confident businessman who had once convinced church leaders to trust him with their congregation's sacred funds. Decades of running from his crimes had taken their toll, and he appeared genuinely relieved when he was finally arrested. "I've been waiting for this day for 27 years, Petrov told Chen during his initial interrogation. "I knew that God would not let me escape justice forever. Rebecca Matthews was a good woman who died because of my greed, and not a day has passed that I haven't regretted what happened in that church office." Petrov's confession filled in the final details of Rebecca's murder and provided the location where her body had been buried. According to his account, the 3 conspirators had panicked after Rebecca's accidental death and had made a series of increasingly poor decisions that transformed a financial fraud into a murder cover-up. "We were supposed to be men of God," Petrov said, tears streaming down his face as he confessed to Chen. "But when we were faced with the consequences of our greed, we chose to compound our sins rather than accept responsibility for what we had done. Rebecca Matthews died because we were too proud and too cowardly to admit our mistakes." The location that Victor Petrov provided for Rebecca Matthews's burial site was a small clearing in the woods behind Hope Baptist Church, less than 200 yards from the sanctuary where she had given her final testimony about God's love knowing no borders. The irony was not lost on Detective Chen or the other investigators. Rebecca had been buried within sight of the building where she had devoted her life to serving others. The recovery of Rebecca's remains was conducted with the reverence and dignity that had been denied to her for 27 years. A team of forensic anthropologists worked carefully to excavate the site, while members of Rebecca's extended family and longtime friends from Hope Baptist Church maintained a prayer vigil nearby. Margaret Foster's nephew, David, stood among the mourners, holding a photograph of his aunt tending Rebecca's memorial garden. "Aunt Margaret always said that Rebecca was still with us somehow," he told the gathered crowd. "She used to say that Rebecca's story wasn't finished, that God was just waiting for the right time to reveal the truth. Looking at all of you here today, I think she was right." The forensic examination confirmed what the conspirators' confessions had already revealed. Rebecca had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with her skull striking a hard surface during the struggle with Petrov. The medical examiner determined that her death would have been nearly instantaneous, a small mercy that provided some comfort to those who had loved her. More importantly, the condition of Rebecca's remains allowed forensic specialists to definitively identify her through dental records and DNA analysis. After 27 years of uncertainty, Rebecca Matthews could finally be laid to rest with the dignity and honor she deserved. The news of Rebecca's murder and the conspiracy that had covered it up sent shockwaves through not just Millbrook, but the entire Tennessee religious community. Hope Baptist Church, which had grown to over 800 members under Pastor Thornton's leadership, suddenly found itself without a pastor and facing questions about how such extensive corruption could have gone undetected for so long. Many current members of the congregation had joined the church long after Rebecca's disappearance and had known nothing about the financial irregularities or the circumstances surrounding her vanishing. For them, the revelations were particularly devastating because they had trusted and respected Pastor Thornton as a spiritual leader for years or even decades. "I feel like everything I believed about this place has been built on a lie," said Jennifer Morrison, a mother of 3 who had joined Hope Baptist Church in 2010. "How do you continue to worship in a building where such terrible things happened? How do you trust any religious leader again when someone you respected for so long was capable of such evil?" But other church members found a different message in Rebecca's story. Despite the corruption and betrayal that had surrounded her death, they saw in her final journal entries a faith that remained unshaken even in the face of mortal danger. Her commitment to protecting the Guatemala mission funds and exposing the truth, even at the cost of her own life, became a powerful testimony to the transformative power of genuine faith. Rebecca showed us what it means to live out your faith when it's difficult, said Thomas Wright, who'd been a teenager in 1996, but remembered Rebecca's testimony about her mission work. She could have kept quiet about what she discovered and returned safely to Guatemala. Instead, she chose to stand up for what was right, knowing the risks involved. That's the kind of Christian courage we should all aspire to. The church board, now consisting entirely of members who had joined after Thornton's tenure began, faced the difficult task of deciding how to move forward. Their first priority was addressing the financial damage caused by decades of embezzlement and fraud. An independent audit revealed that over the years, more than $300,000 had been stolen from various church accounts, with the money used to fund the conspirators' business ventures and personal expenses. The board announced that the church would file insurance claims and pursue legal action to recover whatever assets remained from the stolen funds. They also established a victim compensation fund to reimburse members whose specific donations had been diverted from their intended purposes. But beyond the financial considerations, the church leadership knew they needed to address the spiritual crisis that the revelations had created. How could a congregation heal from the knowledge that their trusted leaders had committed murder? To cover up their financial crimes? How could they continue to worship in a building that had been the scene of such betrayal? The answer came from an unexpected source: Rebecca's own journal entries from the months before her death. As investigators released more of her writings to the public, it became clear that Rebecca had anticipated many of the challenges the church would face. Her reflections on faith, forgiveness, and redemption provided a roadmap for healing that seemed almost prophetically designed for the crisis that would unfold 27 years later. In one entry from September 1996, Rebecca had written, "I've been thinking lately about what it means to be part of a church family. It's not about having perfect leaders or a perfect institution. It's about being a community of broken people who are being transformed by God's grace. Even when we fail each other, even when we sin against each other, God's love remains constant, and His forgiveness is always available to those who truly repent." In another entry, she had reflected on the nature of justice and mercy. "I know that God sees every wrong that is committed, and that He will ensure that justice is ultimately done. But I also know that His heart breaks for both the victims and the perpetrators of evil. He wants all people to come to repentance and find redemption through Christ." My job is not to judge or condemn. It's to speak truth in love and trust that God will work all things together for good. These insights from Rebecca's journal became the foundation for Hope Baptist Church's healing process. Rather than disbanding or relocating, the congregation chose to stay and rebuild, using Rebecca's faith as their guide and her memory as their inspiration. The church board hired an interim pastor, Reverend Michael Stevens, Margaret Foster's great-nephew, who had degrees in both theology and counseling psychology. His first sermon, delivered 3 weeks after Rebecca's body was recovered, focused on the biblical concept of redemption, how God can bring good from even the most terrible circumstances. Rebecca Matthews understood something that we're just beginning to grasp, Reverend Stevens told the congregation. She knew that the church is not a building or an institution, it's a people, and people are flawed, sinful, and in need of grace. But people are also capable of repentance, forgiveness, and transformation. He continued, "What happened to Rebecca was evil. The corruption that led to her death was sin in its rawest form. But Rebecca's response to that evil, her courage, her faith, her forgiveness even for those who threatened her, that shows us the power of God's love to overcome darkness." The congregation voted unanimously to rename their church Rebecca Matthews Memorial Baptist Church, and to dedicate their rebuilt mission program to continuing the work she had started in Guatemala. The memorial garden that Margaret Foster had tended for so many years was expanded into a full memorial park, with walking paths, prayer stations, and educational displays about Rebecca's life and ministry. Most significantly, the church established the Rebecca Matthews Foundation for Global Missions, using the recovered stolen funds and additional donations to support missionary work in Central America. The foundation's first project was completing the medical clinic in Guatemala that Rebecca had been raising funds for when she was killed. Detective Sarah Chen, who had spent her entire career seeking justice for Rebecca, was invited to speak at the church's rededication service. Standing at the same pulpit where Rebecca had given her final testimony, Chen reflected on the long journey from mystery to resolution. 27 years ago, I made a promise to Rebecca Matthews that I would never stop looking for answers about what happened to her, Chen told the congregation. I kept that promise not because it was my job, but because Rebecca represented something that we can't afford to lose, the belief that truth matters, that justice is possible, and that good people deserve our best efforts to protect them. Chen paused, looking out at the faces of people who had been touched by Rebecca's story. Rebecca's journal shows us that she understood she might die for standing up to corruption, but she also believed that her death wouldn't be meaningless if it eventually led to truth and justice. Today, seeing all of you here, seeing the foundation that bears her name, seeing the mission work that continues because of her sacrifice, I think Rebecca would say that her faith has been vindicated. The most moving moment of the service came when Chen presented Rebecca's journal to the church, to be preserved as part of a permanent memorial display. As she handed the leather-bound book to Reverend Stevens, she said, "This journal contains the last thoughts and prayers of a remarkable young woman. But more than that, it contains a roadmap for how to maintain faith in the face of evil, how to choose courage over comfort, and how to trust God's timing even when justice seems delayed." The rededication service was attended by over 1,000 people, including representatives from churches throughout Tennessee, former missionaries who had worked with Rebecca in Guatemala, and law enforcement officers who had worked on her case. Over the years, the service was broadcast live on local television and streamed online, carrying Rebecca's story and message to a much wider audience than she could have ever reached in life. Victor Petrov, awaiting trial in federal prison, sent a letter that was read during the service. In it, he wrote, I destroyed a beautiful life through my greed and pride. I cannot undo the evil I have done, but I can bear witness to the truth and ask for the forgiveness I do not deserve. Rebecca Matthews was everything I was not: honest, selfless, and genuinely devoted to serving God. If there is any justice in this world, it is that her legacy will far outlast mine. Petrov ultimately pled guilty to charges of murder, conspiracy, and fraud. At age 74 and in declining health, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He spent his remaining years participating in prison ministry programs and writing letters to churches, warning them about the dangers of financial corruption and the importance of transparency in religious institutions. The impact of Rebecca's story extended far beyond Millbrook. Churches across the country implemented new financial oversight procedures, inspired by the tragedy that had resulted from unchecked authority and inadequate accountability. Seminaries began including courses on ethical leadership and financial stewardship in their pastoral training programs. The Rebecca Matthews Foundation grew into a significant force for global missions, funding medical clinics, schools, and clean water projects in some of the world's most underserved communities. Each project included a plaque that read, "In memory of Rebecca Matthews, who believed that God's love knows no borders and that truth will always overcome darkness." 10 years after Rebecca's body was recovered, the foundation had completed projects in 12 countries and had trained over 200 missionaries to carry on her work. The medical clinic in Guatemala that had been her final mission goal had grown into a regional medical center serving over 50,000 people annually. But perhaps the most significant impact of Rebecca's story was on the individuals whose lives were touched by her example of faith in the face of adversity. Hundreds of people wrote to the church describing how Rebecca's journal entries had helped them through their own struggles with doubt, fear, and injustice. One letter from a young woman facing threats for exposing corruption in her workplace said, "Reading Rebecca's journal gave me the courage to continue speaking truth even when it's dangerous. She showed me that some things are worth risking everything for, and that God honors those who stand up for what's right, even when the cost is high." Another letter from a pastor who had discovered financial irregularities in his own church wrote, "Rebecca's story taught me that true spiritual leadership requires the courage to confront evil, even when it's uncomfortable or costly. Because of her example, I found the strength to address corruption in my own congregation, and though it was painful, it ultimately led to healing and renewal." Detective Sarah Chen, who retired from law enforcement in 2025, often spoke at conferences about the importance of never giving up on cold cases. She always ended her presentations with Rebecca's story, emphasizing that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. Rebecca Matthews waited 27 years for justice, Chen would tell her audiences, but when it finally came, it brought with it not just resolution for her case, but redemption for an entire community. Sometimes God's timing is perfect, in ways we can't understand until we see the full picture. The story of Rebecca Matthews became a powerful testament to the enduring power of faith, the importance of standing up for truth, and the ultimate triumph of justice over corruption. Her journal, preserved now in the church that bears her name, continues to inspire new generations of believers to live with courage, speak with honesty, and trust that God's plan for justice will ultimately prevail. In the end, Rebecca's disappearance had indeed served a purpose that she could never have imagined. Her death had exposed a web of corruption. Her faith had inspired a community's healing, and her legacy had become a beacon of hope for those facing their own struggles against injustice and evil. The young missionary who had believed that God's love knows no borders had proven that truth too knows no boundaries of time or circumstance. 27 years after her voice was silenced, Rebecca Matthews spoke more powerfully than ever, reminding the world that faith, courage, and truth will always overcome darkness, no matter how long they must wait for their moment to shine. As Margaret Foster had faithfully believed until her dying day, Rebecca's story was never really over. It was just waiting for God's perfect timing to reveal its full meaning and power. And in that revelation, an entire community found not just answers to their questions, but hope for their future and strength for their own journeys of faith. The rain that had fallen on that October night in 1996 had long since nourished the earth and returned to the sky. But the seeds of truth that Rebecca had planted through her courage and faith had finally bloomed into a harvest of justice, redemption, and renewed hope that would continue to grow for generations to come.